This is no ordinary place. You've seen that. I know you have. John Locke, Lost. Between 2012 and 2017, Nintendo had a social media site called Memeverse, meant to accompany the 3DS and Wii U systems. If nothing else, if you've been on the site, you probably remember the heavy moderation and a large presence of children. You probably haven't paid much attention to it though. In the few mentions I've seen of Memeverse in the past few years, it has been described as a strange blurb in the history of video games and the internet. A weird concept that caused weird results. But to those of us who grew up alongside it, it was much more. This site, with all its quirks and mistakes, shaped us, and served as an important battleground in the story of our lives. Somehow, the heavy, inaccurate moderation of the Miiverse administration, mixed with a precise amount of bad personal decisions and some very salty tears, created the perfect conditions for a specific type of pawn scum to flourish. That scum was the Miiverse hackers. Those who, with similar methods, manners, and motives, hacked the site, bypassing restrictions and attracting attention with hacked posts and automated activity. I was a Memeverse hacker, and the web of causes and consequences surrounding my decisions has connections throughout my entire life. The issue is a complex and personal one, and I can't say my words are free from emotional biases. Yet, after over 3 years of deep consideration, I honestly believe myself to be the most qualified person to examine the medium, causes, and consequences for the persona that we created. I will go over every aspect of the issue over the course of 2 videos, covering first the methods and the medium in which the actions took place, and second the fundamental motives for the actions we took and their consequences, examining all their manifestations across time. May 29th is a very special day, the 4-year anniversary of the creation of my first hacked account. The next video will be released 2 weeks from now, on the same anniversary of my hyperban. Although, as a sucker for sentimentality, I created a single alt on the last day of Memeverse's existence, the critical moment of the things I am going to discuss only occurred over a 2-week period. It was a quick burn, but the ripples that extend from this 2-week explosion, both into the past and future, spread far enough to power a lifetime of discussion. Let's get started. If you're unfamiliar with the Memeverse service, that's okay. It had many of the markings of traditional social media sites: followers, posts, comments, etc. But it had some characteristics that made it very separate from any social media site of comparable popularity before or after it. There are only 3 things that are really important to know, however. The first is that the site was organized with communities for different games. Each community restricted the type of content you could post in order to keep things relevant. For example, if you were in the Super Smash Bros. Community, you could only post screenshots from that game. Posts were meant to be strictly related to games, comments, criticisms, or questions about specific game content. Because of this striving for relevancy, no external multimedia was allowed. You couldn't post external videos or pictures or tag other users. Secondly, instead of likes, dislikes, or favorites, Memeverse only had one way to respond to a post besides replying: the yeah, a button supposed to indicate agreement with a post's content. It's likely this simple design was chosen as a way to enforce positivity. If you agreed with a post, you yahed it. If you didn't, you either ignored the post or were forced to go through the mental effort of writing a reply to criticize it. If you didn't have anything nice to say, they thought, you wouldn't say it. Unfortunately, this silly little button had its pitfalls, for slightly different reasons I'll describe later. Finally, most strangely, and perhaps most importantly, Memeverse strove to be a family-friendly website, a concept that may sound incredible to many. Children and adults of all ages were allowed to use the site, though it was only legal for children under 13 if their parents approved it with a microtransaction on their credit card. I'll talk about the dynamics this age discrepancy created later, but for now, all you need to know is how this family-friendly goal was achieved. In tandem with the basic content restrictions mentioned earlier, which limited the types of inappropriate tomfoolery one could post, there was very heavy, partially automated moderation, and a complex system of reprimands and bans of different types. Nintendo had a set of Miiverse rules, a code of conduct that all users were expected to follow. If someone's post violated these Memeverse rules, that post would be removed. After several posts from the same user were removed, Nintendo might decide to give a temporary ban to that user, as a form of discipline. If problems continued even after they had been temporarily banned, they might eventually be banned permanently. On the 3DS, that was usually where the story ended. But on the Wii U, several accounts could exist on the same system. Nintendo could either judge to ban just that one user, or all of the accounts on that Wii, as a precaution to halt the creation of alternate accounts. The system that allowed this wide-reaching policy to function is also essential to note. The admins couldn't personally examine every post, though each post likely went through an automated preliminary scan for obvious profanity or abuse, so some level of community support was necessary. Thus, an essential part of the Miiverse experience for many was the report button. This is a normal feature for social media sites and isn't unique to Miiverse by any means. But on Miiverse, the report button was one of the most common ways to interact with a post, and was very important on a platform that attempted to remain family-friendly. The method for discovering violations, as well as the structure of the punishments, were riddled with some pretty glaring issues. While the Miiverse Code of Conduct restricted things that included actual profanity, porn, and illegal activity, it was also involved in much more vague gray areas of inconsiderate behavior, bullying, and advertising, in addition to fairly subjective criteria for personal information, religious or political content, and content related to the transferal of goods or money. Thus, a pretty clear problem arose. No matter how well they designed the basic system, the final decision was given to the subjective judgment of the algorithm and whichever staff member was in charge of post review at a given time. This meant that the series of bans I described earlier, which wasn't a horrible idea all on its own, was polluted by subjectivity. A temporary ban could be given after as few as 1 or as many as 21 posts were removed. There's no real upper limit, but that's the highest number I've seen recorded. The average was probably around 3. A permanent ban could be given after as few as 0 or as many as, again, there's no real upper limit, of these temporary bans had been dished out, and the decision to limit it to one account or tie it to the system with a console ban was also based on subjective judgment. If these variations in punishment had anything to do with an objective measure of violation severity, there wouldn't have been a problem. Unfortunately, this discrepancy had nothing to do with that. Instead, because of the lack of specificity in the Miiverse rules, it had everything to do with the subjective choices of whomever or whatever the flag violation was sent to, which could leave you with extremely varied results. Since this subjectivity meant that essentially any post could be interpreted to break the code of conduct if you squinted hard enough, the report button was way too powerful. If you didn't like someone, you just had to look for their post where they expressed anger or sadness or regret, any negative human emotion, and report them. There'd be a very high chance that, even if most people wouldn't consider these posts to be violations, at least one of the administrators one of these posts was sent to would decide that a post did indeed violate the code of conduct. Thus, people could post content in much darker gray areas than others and have no violations, because no one reported them and their content wasn't bad enough to be automatically flagged by an admin bot, while others whose content fell under much lighter gray areas could quickly become permabanned if enough people just happened to be rubbed the wrong way and decided to report them. These issues induced much wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth in the Miiverse community. Many Miiverse users simply accepted the fact that they would most likely be permanently banned from the site at some point, while at the same time many others had 13 violations and no bans at all. Strategies for avoiding violations were discussed, and the true identity of the admins was debated. Who were the admins? A dark shadow or misunderstood fighter for justice? Some piously held that the admins were real people, just doing their best, while others claimed that the whole thing was just a poorly designed algorithm. From my best judgment, I've assumed that the admins were probably a mixture of the two. A system where an algorithm checked for possible violations, acted on obvious ones, and sent posts it wasn't sure about to a real person for review. But I guess we'll never really know. Regardless, the design was a disaster, and anyone who'd been banned for what they themselves subjectively judged not to be a violation could feel the anger. Of course, they had better watch out not to express it too freely, lest the admins decided their feelings might be hateful or inappropriate. While the controversial workings of the admins may have been extremely important, Memeverse hackers would never have taken their place unless those other two aspects I mentioned earlier weren't also in place as well. The admins provided a great enemy that one could be tempted to overcome, but it wasn't just the failures of the admins that could provide rage. So could the restrictions of photos, videos, and other post content. Not being able to post certain images and videos, and being limited to specific topics and communities, was frustrating to many. If these restrictions could be overcome, the satisfaction would be immense, wouldn't it? What if frustration against the admins itself could be expressed in ways that overcame these other restrictions? The possibilities would be endless. But first, let's talk about those problems with Yaz I hinted at earlier that made Memeverse even riper for the taking. You see, the notification system for Memeverse was very simple. You were notified if someone followed you, you were notified if someone replied to you, and by default, you were notified if one or more people yahed any of your posts. Where notifications generally aren't all that important on other sites, as they can mean anything from friend requests and follows to group activity and recommended posts, on Memeverse they only meant one of three very specific things, which Yaz were included in, despite the low effort and feeling involved in the action. It doesn't take much imagination to think of how this aspect could be abused to get someone's or everyone's attention. If all at once you yahed every single one of someone's posts, they would get a separate notification for every single one of your yas, something that wasn't likely to go unnoticed. Thus, people who wanted someone to notice them could, after writing many needed replies, go through every one of that person's posts and yeah them until that person finally gave in. Of course, it was possible to disable yeah notifications, and many did, yet that decision wasn't without its drawbacks, since it then became harder to gauge how many real yas you were getting. In addition, many people were unaware that disabling notifications was something someone could even do. Eventually, this opening for abuse was taken full advantage of, with very simple automation consisting of a one-line iMacro script and an auto-scroller browser extension. One could select a community and go back in time to yeah everybody's posts in that community for the past week, month, year, or lifetime. Thus, any regular poster would be notified of your existence, and your life would finally have meaning. Shortly after the release of the browser version of Memeverse in April 2013, yeah bombers of different types began to show up in different communities on the site. Some played the long, slow game, keeping the script running on refresh, yowing every new post that was made, while some took the more extreme method of past yang that I just described. Regardless, yeah bombers, which Memeverse hackers were, made their names known at the expense of the reputation of an idea that could have been good. The simplicity of the yeah may have been better utilized to encourage positivity in the community. Unfortunately, that was not destined to be. At least, not then. And where were the admins during all this? The ones supposed to keep Memeverse a fun and enjoyable experience for everyone? Well, they were somewhere else. Probably off banning some poor kid. While generally those who passed the ad post long enough in enough communities would get banned, there was no explicit mention against automation in the Memeverse Code of Conduct, and many people, such as Yeah Angel, managed to get every single new post in every community for several months or even years before consequences were finally dished out. Thus, the admins were strict when they shouldn't have been, and lenient when the actual Memeverse experience was at stake. All the unique points of Memeverse, from Yaz, communities, and moderation, however well-intentioned they may have been, had severe failings that stifled the experience on the site, while leaving holes open for abuse. In this environment, the general Memeverse community, usually gauged by the New Super Luigi U community, one of the only communities where off-topic discussion was allowed for some reason, became very, very toxic. The entire Memeverse was a confusion of low-quality attention-seeking content and worsening anger against every broken aspect of the site, all under a backdrop of widespread fake Yaz and censorship. It was then when the Memeverse hackers came to save the day. Or to add fire to the flame, depending on who you ask. That part of the line was not entrenched, and in front of it the ground was more open and level than elsewhere. It was evident to anyone, military or not, that it was here the Memeverse hackers should attack. Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace. Now, the method of Memeverse hacking was relatively simple. Actually, scratch that. It was extremely easy, especially if you started as late as I did, posting in May to June 2017, requiring almost no thought at all since most methods were already made public by PF2M and Ariane Cordy. However, to actually put them into practice required some serious determination. Not intelligence or industriousness, but determination nonetheless, as well as certain sacrifices. The methods for bypassing administrator bans and the methods for bypassing the basic content restrictions of the site were different, so we'll discuss each separately. When it comes to the content restrictions of the site, most exploits were enabled by the fact that each type of device that could access Memeverse, whether it be a 3DS, Wii U, or browser, accessed it from a separate domain. Rather than having one domain that behaved differently depending on what device accessed it, the 3DS, Wii U, and PC each had their own domains through which they interacted with the Memeverse servers. The 3DS and Wii U domains, which I'll call 3DSverse and Wii U-verse respectively from now on, were not very secure. I guess because they hoped that no one would ever guess their domain names. Unfortunately for that hope, to find out those domains, as well as everything you needed to know to authenticate yourself with them, all you needed to do was a simple run of Telerik Fiddler, a program that can be used to find out what data is being sent to different servers on specific devices. Finding it out in this way didn't even require homebrew on your device. All you needed was to set your proxy settings up correctly. Then, you needed to install an SSL certificate to trick Nintendo into thinking you were on a 3DS or Wii U. You still couldn't access Memeverse with the link yet, but after you found the parent pack for the community you wanted to access and the service token for Nintendo Network ID, then inserted them both into an HTTP header browser extension, voila! You are now signed in on Memeverse like you would have been on a 3DS or Wii U, except on a PC. And since Nintendo really didn't anticipate such an eventuality, both sites were put together with Elmers. Thus, there were hundreds of ways to use a computer to break the site. Most of the post content restrictions were bypassed using JavaScript bookmarklets on the post page to open up inputs that were usually unavailable. All that really meant was that we were using inputs that Nintendo had already made for special communities, people, and events in places and times they weren't usually allowed. Embedded videos were posted this way, by snagging an input box that was usually meant to be used by verified users making announcements. In-game posts, in communities where they usually weren't allowed, such as the Super Smash Bros. Community, were possible with a one-line bookmarklet that simply changed what kind of post it was. Pictures were a little more complicated, since you needed to use a specific parent pack with the domain before the bookmarklet worked, but they essentially functioned the same way. Let me stress again that I did not make or help to make any of these methods. When I started hacking Memeverse, all this was already laid out before me. All I had to do was plug in the scripts. I actually ended up writing one script on my own, though someone had already made a different version of it before me. You see, it wasn't just the inputs on Wii U and 3DSverse that were insecure, but the most basic unit of interaction on the site as well. The Yeah button. When an account on Memeverse is banned, it's impossible for you to post, view other posts, or even sign in on the browser site. But on the 3DS and Wii U apps, you could still sign in and view posts, just without interacting with them. When in this state, the post and Yeah buttons were both grayed out so you couldn't press them. While there were some server-side checks to prevent banned users from posting, Yaz took no such precautions. This meant that with simple inspect element fiddling on the Wii U domain, you could yeah a post while you were banned just by changing the state of the yeah button element. Taken to its logical extension, yeah bombing could also be achieved with a unique form of attention gain as people wondered how someone who was banned was yahing their posts. Arion created the original Tamper Monkey script to loop the inspect element adjustments, and gave it to Eric D, who gave it to Talon, who gave it to Seth. When both Seth and Eric D wouldn't give it to me, I was forced to innovate the most I ever did, by writing a 5-line JavaScript snippet. In addition to these Wii U and 3DS specific exploits, there were some gimmicks executable from regular old browser Memeverse. On a page with many Memeverse users, such as the list of people following a verified user, you could run a follow bot to follow and immediately unfollow users on that page. Just as yas get people's attention, follows do as well, and the gesture is much more likely to result in reciprocity. When someone got a notification that you followed them, many people were inclined to follow you back immediately, without doing their homework on your content first, or on whether or not you were actually still even following them. This was how I managed to amass over 1,000 followers on some of my accounts, though if the script was used more diligently, it probably would have been possible to gain many more. Since the browser site afforded faster loading times, yeah-bomb scripts were usually used there, and backwards notifications could be utilized to add extra chaos. If a right-left text character, a special Unicode character not possible to type on a 3DS or Wii U, was added to the end of your name, everything in the HTML element after it would be reversed, resulting in notifications which were backwards. This character could be added by editing the cfldb.dat file on your computer for your 3DS Me. Although often your name would be censored by the admins after a couple hours of yeah-bombing with backwards notifs, the attention gain would be much greater for that brief period. If nothing else, the nature of these exploits helps show just how horribly designed Memeverse was on the security front, to the point where those who were temperamentally inclined to do so were almost invited to hack the site. Of course, once these Wii U and 3DS verse specific exploits were used, you were basically guaranteed to get your account permanently banned within 12 to 72 hours, depending on how many hacked posts you made and how fast you made them. If your hacked account was on a Wii U, there was extremely high risk of getting console banned, permanently ruining the fun for you and everyone on your system. But an intrepid adventurer need not fear, for there was a way around that as well. If you had a 3DS with homebrew and custom firmware, there was a very simple workaround that would allow you to make as many accounts as you wanted. What was it? Well, on Memeverse, console bans were tracked using your system's serial number. Since somehow Nintendo had no check at all for whether or not a serial number was real, you could just go into your 3DS's files and change the serial number in your Secure Info A file to literally any 8-digit series of numbers. At the same time, you could go back and clear the file that held your Nintendo Network ID, so you could start anew without even going through the formatting process. With this method, accounts could be created, console banned, and recreated in extremely short periods of time. On my first day hacking Memeverse, I created and banned 4 accounts, and went on to make over 15 accounts total. Of course, we were warned that once the decision was made to martyr a 3DS, the decision was made. The expectation was that we would never be able to partake in legitimate online play on that device ever again, and perhaps we didn't take that enough to heart. In truth, making infinite accounts was equivalent to device sacrifice. With infinite accounts at our disposal, the potential of in-game posts, embedded images and videos, and the ability to get every post in the community very fast was greatly increased, and there was nothing for us to fear, except for the hyperban. A special type of ban associated with your system's device ID, a unique, unchangeable value that was only gifted to the most proficient delinquents. As opposed to serial numbers, which the console ban ruled by, device IDs are made specifically for each device, and if you attempted to use a device ID that wasn't officially tied to a Nintendo system, it wouldn't work. Also, unlike console bans, the hyperban's jurisdiction wasn't limited to Memeverse. Once that device ID was marked, you were done. online activity of all kinds was prohibited permanently. Goodbye Mario Kart, Flip Notes, and eShop. Goodbye friend lists, Spot Pass, and DLC. Access to online services was gone forever. Of course, actually getting hyperbanned was difficult. Usually, it took many accounts before Nintendo actually decided to deal the final blow. Yet, even though it was potentially possible, if you weren't hyperbanned, to stop hacking Miiverse and start playing games normally again, it would be unwise to associate your main account with your hacked 3DS. You see, the device ID remembers. Nintendo always knew which accounts were being created by which device ID. It was only a matter of whether or not they decided to actually enforce any discipline. After a certain number of hacked accounts were made, eventually a Memeverse hacker would start to get new accounts banned moments after creation, before any posts were even made. This was called Hyperban Burn, and was a subtle hint from the shadows that Nintendo was not pleased with your actions, and that you were on a very short leash. The real issue, though, was that this could also work with older accounts. If you hacked enough and originally created your main account on your hacked system, Nintendo could associate your main Nintendo Network ID with your hacked device ID and ban it as well. Thus, you were never free of consequences, even if you were extremely careful. If the Nintendo Network ID that you used personally was associated with the device ID you used to hack, Nintendo could screw you over with a push of a button, something they did to me. In conclusion, though there was a small amount of complexity in the various things that were done to hack Miiverse, the actual methods were simple, especially after tutorials were released by Arion Cordy and PF2M in late 2016 and early 2017. The exploits that were possible essentially bypassed all the restrictions discussed in the previous part, and were very desirable in that way. However, the trade-offs and consequences of Miiverse hacking, which were known to later Miiverse hackers from the get-go, served as the true test of determination and commitment, and will prove to be extremely important later on. There was another issue that existed with Miiverse as well, but would Miiverse hackers also be able to bypass it? Let's find out. You know, that's the first thing that got to me about this place. That there wasn't anybody laughing. I haven't heard a real laugh since I came through that door. Do you know that? Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The dictionary definition of meme is an idea that is transmitted by repetition and replication in a manner similar to the biological transmission of genes. In modern usage, they are often shared through image and video, but by no means have to be. Despite Miiverse's video and picture restrictions, there was no limit to the number of memes that were created, and these memes were able to take a unique form that in many ways couldn't be seen anywhere else. Yet, this unique form may or may not have actually been any good. There were negative consequences to this stifled form of humor the restrictions of the Miiverse administration created, and Miiverse hackers were supposed to be the ones able to lift them and free Miiverse humor forever. But did this happen? Let's start this story from the beginning. With children on the platform, strange dynamics were created. Most children on the site lied about their age. This isn't a revelation unique to Memeverse, but nowhere else did it occur to the same extent. On other sites, the children who join them have to at least have reached a level where they're willing to consciously lie to access social media with a specific goal in mind. This was not so much the case with Memeverse. Since Memeverse was allowed for children by design, it wasn't much of a stretch of conscience to add a few years to your birth date, just so you didn't have to bother your parents to get them to type in their credit card. Also, many children who made Nintendo Network IDs with false ages did so to access other services, such as the eShop or multiplayer games, then stumbled into Memeverse later without a complete picture of what they were getting into. They were unlikely to have used social media before, or even understand what social media was. Getting into a conversation with a new person on Memeverse was an uncertain ordeal. You could be stepping into a valuable, lifelong relationship, but much more likely, you'd fall into a mind-numbing discussion with someone who didn't even know how to spell, much less how to grammar. This uncertainty pervaded the culture of Memeverse, and along with most things, it was linked with the basic restrictions of the site. We've talked about how because of the simplicity and abusability of the yeah, you couldn't tell whether someone who yahed your post actually agreed with it, had a liberal yeah policy, or were just looking for attention. Because of the site's restrictions with pictures and audio and video all prohibited, and the fact that the only representation of each user was an 80 by 80 pixel picture of a me, total anonymity was encouraged. Much like 4chan, so that it wasn't just age that people lied about, but gender, appearance, nationality, and overall identity and experience. I remember that at some point before I began hacking, I decided to change my me so that it had a goatee and stash, legitimately hoping to convince people that I had cool facial hair. After a couple days, I turned it back, feeling a twinge of conscience for where such a fundamental lie would take me. But it shows just how much people were able to and willing to lie for seemingly pointless reasons. This created an overall cynicism and distrust in the longtime members of the Memeverse community. Truth wasn't a common experience on the site, so those who used it regularly came to distrust the concept itself. Thus, reality had very little bearing on the humor and culture of Memeverse. It just wasn't one of the things that was considered when posting. Instead, much more basic considerations of survival from the admins were much more important. However, the admins themselves further encouraged meaningless and/or simplified views of reality in ways that will soon become apparent. Despite the admins' goals that everyone be considerate to other users, there was no end to the negativity available on Memeverse. This wasn't the real problem, though. The problem was that because of the incentives the admins created, this negativity very rarely ventured past the highest level of abstraction. The way reports and bans worked, you were more likely to be banned for criticizing something specific than you were for keeping everything broad and vague. So if someone or something was wrong, they were wrong in the broadest possible way. A bad action meant a bad person. A bad feature meant a bad concept. It was occasionally possible for people to engage in a more detailed dialogue, but the basic demographics of the site, in tandem with administrative failure, did not encourage this to occur. Places like the Mario Maker meetings were able to encourage constructive criticism by setting a specific tone and structure, yet even they were not immune from problems. In most places, since the chances of banning didn't decrease as the quality of analysis went up, no one bothered to increase the quality of analysis. Besides, on a site dominated by children, who would want to read a specific practical critique anyway? This same need not apply attitude, combined with indifference towards truth and the broadness encouraged by the site, seeped into Memeverse humor as well. It seems very likely that given the dangers of humor in the presence of the admins, Memeverse could have ended up humorless, the lifeless soup of basic observations about video games it sometimes seemed Nintendo wanted. But luckily, life found a way, albeit a stifled one. Because the admins could go berserk at the drop of a hat, the memes that didn't trigger the admins, the only memes that could spread, used vagueness as a shield. Words like badmins became popular as broad, vague, and inoffensive ways to criticize the admins, though some people have gotten banned after using them. Fighting vagueness with vagueness, Memeverse humor took the form of dry inside jokes, broad, subtle jabs, and vaguely directed irony. Very few people were willing to commit to any serious memes, sticking instead to things that could only be interpreted as funny with some sort of inside knowledge. However, so long as a specific target was maintained, vagueness or subtlety in technique could actually be used very effectively. On screen is an example of how this type of subtle, inconspicuous humor could be done correctly. In it, Ryan is mocking someone who intended to be offensive and inflammatory. Devin, the person about to get dunked on, is the one making a broad criticism of someone from isolated actions. Namely, that you're a kid because you don't know how to spell. Then, Ryan takes the opportunity to make a subtle criticism of a specific action of Devin's. Devin made a baseless, ad hominem attack and thoughtlessly made the same mistake as the person whom he attacked. As a consequence, Ryan attacked a specific action of Devin's, simultaneously revealing a hilarious hypocrisy, staying under the admin's radar, and avoiding the decay of a broad accusation. The problem was that due to the distrust of truth from children on the platform and the lack of administrative reinforcement, mockery done right in this way was a very rare occurrence. In that example, truth was not lost because it kept a specific action as the focus of its mockery, without making broad judgments. It maintained subtlety in the way it was carried out, but had a specific point to sell. This was not what usually happened though. With the large presence of children on the site, and the distrust and need not apply attitude that came with it, mockery on Memeverse usually made broad judgments, with little to no specific provocation. The tragedy is that the environment Memeverse created encouraged this. People mocking vague, meaningless points were encouraged because they were less likely to piss someone off and get banned, while people who mocked specific ideas were discouraged. When you stop mocking for specific, tangible reasons and start allowing because it's funny to count as your sole motive for everything, things deteriorate very quickly. When anything is open to ridicule, it can become very difficult to decide what things should be taken seriously, a point that will prove to be extremely important in the next video. While subtle broad mockery wasn't the only type of humor on Memeverse, it certainly dominated a large space, and other types of humor that were used, like puns and non sequiturs, were stifled by the admin's restrictions in a similar way, and their prominence showcased just how limited in scope Memeverse humor was. We've seen how the idea of objective truth deteriorated in many Memeverse users, encouraging undefined points which were in turn encouraged by the way the admins functioned. But the way the community responded further intensified this positive feedback loop. Only the intelligent children and adults who could catch on to and use subtle vague hints could rise up in the Memeverse community. Those who were oblivious to such hints were preyed on, both by the administration and other Memeverse users, until they either left the site or became hardened like everyone else. Thus, things worsened over time, with no mechanism for improvement. Many people saw what the admins and children did to humor on the site, and thought that finding a way to bypass the restrictions they enacted would help to make Memeverse humor better. Unfortunately, there are a few reasons why Memeverse hackers were not the knights in shining armor. For one, we were never completely immune from the admins, and even though posting illegal media was an immediate strike from the admins, and we had nearly infinite accounts anyway, we maintained a sense of self-preservation. Although our goals varied at different times, another topic for the next video, we often wanted our accounts to last as long as possible, and maintain the natural arsenal of vague tricks to do so. In addition, despite claiming to be the freers of Memeverse, we ultimately remained subjects of the culture we claimed to revolutionize. We were the results of the dissolution of truth on Memeverse, and we were results of that positive feedback loop where vagueness and subtlety were rewarded. So, no. Even with our new tools, we did not change Memeverse humor, but rather kept to more of the same. In doing so, our content could only have been described as a cheaper version of the contagious, sometimes dry, sometimes brutally honest memes Memeverse had to offer. Memes that could only have formed on a site where children and adults coexisted in such a blatant manner. I want to end this part with two questions which I don't know the answers to and can't give proper attention to within the scope of this video, but are important nonetheless and may be tackled at another time. First, to what extent did Memeverse and all the deficiencies in its design and culture create us, the Memeverse hackers? The next video will cover the specific aspects of Memeverse hackers that made us attracted to Memeverse hacking and some of their manifestations in the hacking persona and our greater lives. But I won't attempt to venture deep into the causes of this, because I don't know the answers, and I just don't think it's relevant right now. But it can't be argued that growing up in a place where truth is so uniquely arbitrary and incentives so uniquely corrupt wouldn't change some fundamental aspects of personality moving forward. Just some food for thought before we finish this half of the analysis. Second, how can social media be used in an environment with children? Memeverse took one extreme, where children were actively invited to use the site, and as a result, restrictions were enacted to comply with COPPA, and it didn't seem to work very well. But the feeling of seemingly arbitrary exclusion that is spread by social media sites who set fruitless 13-year-old limits doesn't really help either. Children mature at different rates, have wildly varying experiences, and unique forms of intelligence that can be centered around different traits. When children get involved, the diversity of a platform increases tremendously, and no one is quite sure what to do with it. It seems that all paths that have been attempted so far have been disastrous. This is a really important discussion that needs to be had, and I think our society as a whole has been avoiding it in a way which is extremely unhealthy.
Kyle Lexington, he's always been so smart, but he used to get teased.
Let me explain it to you. Let me run it down just briefly if I can. We're looking for the American dream, and we were told it was somewhere in this area. Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. We've seen how the unique features of Memeverse, from post-interaction to organization and moderation, while ultimately created with good intentions, caused great problems in the experience of the site and left many weak points open to be abused. We saw exactly how they were abused with a very simple method, eventually made completely public in 2016. And finally, we saw how the unique aspects of Memeverse not only left weak points open to be attacked, but created the environment where someone who would want to attack them would be further encouraged to do so by a failing culture and lack of truth which appeared to be caused by things that could be bypassed through such attacks. But the method had very real consequences as well, something which will reveal a unique judgment. All of these aspects were essential for the existence of the unique specimen of Memeverse hacking on the platform, and it couldn't have looked the same anywhere else. Memeverse wasn't just a funny little platform, but the perfect storm for a unique persona to emerge. While many of its quirks and features exist on other social media sites, nowhere else were they all put together in such an extreme way. Ambiguous moderation is a problem in many places, but Memeverse was stricter and more ambiguous than all, leading to a uniquely corrupt culture. Other sites have content restrictions and anonymity, but few to such a universal extent or with Memeverse's truly diverse user base. Many sites can be gamed or hacked, but Memeverse had an ease of method combined with a large number of users that simply can't be found anywhere else, when popular sites are too secure and the sites that can be gamed are too tiny to consider. In truth, I think it can be seen that Memeverse revealed an extreme microcosm of the issues all people of our generation face. The story of corrupt organization and moderation, paired with anonymity and cheap abuses, is common to many. But on Memeverse, everything was there, out in the open, all at once. And the story of what the people on this site did and desired is of practical relevance to anyone in the modern age. There's one more thing that made Memeverse and Memeverse hacking special, but it was only important to a specific type of person. You see, Memeverse hacking gives you power. Power no one else around you possesses. Although it may not seem this way from the outside, the ability to see things others can't see, post things others can't post, and do things others can't do changes your relationship with those around you, despite the fact that your abilities are limited to the digital space. They may have seemed trivial to others, but to us, these powers had a lot to offer, and Memeverse was offering them up cheaper than anyone else. We liked the power of Memeverse hacking more than we should have, and once we had it, we liked it even more. Seeing ourselves in a class of our own, as greater, regardless of whether or not we were inclined to feel that way before. With new abilities that none of our peers possessed, we worked with the aspects of the platform to truly cast ourselves in a greater light. We began to think we had justice in our hands, with particular powers we could unleash at will that no one else could use. It fueled an ego inside all of us, hungry to separate ourselves from others in some fundamental way. This hungry ego, driven towards the smorgasbord which was Memeverse, would react with a vengeance, resulting in extreme manifestations in every aspect of our lives. And in the end, we got what we wished for. We were separated from others. Just not in a good way. This wish is extremely important, especially considering the fact that it wasn't shared by others who used Memeverse. In fact, with the consequences of Memeverse hacking from Part 2 in mind, most people couldn't seem to comprehend why we even did what we did. Despite understanding all the issues of Memeverse and possessing the ability to hack after 2016, most people didn't, and the number of Memeverse hackers remained countable on 2 sets of hands and feet. In part, it was this secret desire for power, not shared by other users, that accounts for the difference between ourselves and other Memeverse users. Memeverse hackers were special, not because of their intelligence and ability, but because of their motives and desires. In the next video, the issues of Memeverse will take the back seat to a discussion of these motives and desires that separated us. But let's not forget what Memeverse meant. We may or may not have already had those desires, and these desires will prove to be of singular importance. But without Memeverse and our relationship to it, things would never have manifested in the way they did. We were crazy people, but Memeverse was a crazy website. This is just the beginning of the story. 40 minutes in, we've barely touched on the issues of motive, and I've yet to even mention the aspects of persona and what they caused. There's so much more to tell if you're willing to accompany me on June 12th, the 4th anniversary of my hyperban, for the rest of the story.